What if it goes wrong? What then? What? Boom. Yeah. That would suck, huh? Yeah. So, where are they going to do it? Like, way out in the boonies or what? What? Chicago? But what if... I got nothing. December 4th, 1942. This week, something happens that really will eventually change how the whole world thinks about things. For real. This week sees the first ever man-made controlled nuclear chain reaction. We have entered the nuclear age. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the huge Soviet counteroffensive continued, surrounding hundreds of thousands of men near Stalingrad. They also launched other offensives farther north. The Allied advance into Tunisia was slowed, however, and the French scuttled their fleet at Toulon to prevent it falling into German hands. Here's what follows. On the 30th comes the naval battle of Tassafaronga. Since the Japanese cannot afford to lose any more transports, and since their submarines have only limited transport capacity, Reizo Tanaka's destroyers are towing drums laden with all sorts of supplies into Iron Bottom Sound. Sailors cleaned heavy drums and filled them with 330 pounds of rice and barley. They loaded between 200 and 240 drums, joined in clusters by ropes, on the weather deck of each destroyer. Once off Guadalcanal, the clusters of drums would be shoved overboard close to the landing points and pulled ashore by a central line. This method would require only 20 destroyer runs per month to feed 20,000 men and drastically reduce the exposure period of each destroyer by minimizing the amount of time spent off Guadalcanal. Tanaka has 8 destroyers, but American Carlton Wright has 4 heavy cruisers and 1 light one, and 6 destroyers. Wright's task force leaves Espiritu Santo at midnight the 29th and heads for Guadalcanal. The two sides meet the night of the 30th. Tanaka's men are topside readying the drums for their swim when their enemy appears. So some of the drum clusters are just dumped as torpedoes are hastily made ready. Radar helps the Americans attack first, and they concentrate fire and seriously damage destroyer Takanami, which will later sink. But the Japanese response is just deadly. Captain Torajiro Sato executed one of the most professionally skilled performances of any Imperial Navy destroyer commander during the war. See, his 4-destroyer unit is hugging the coast, and they haven't really been spotted by the enemy ships. So they quietly maintain their position and their reduced speed until they are to the southeast of the damaged Takanami. Then they turn, and in 10 minutes launch 44 long lance torpedoes. They sink a cruiser and badly damage, cripple 3 more. Minneapolis and New Orleans are torpedoed within seconds of each other. Pensacola follows, and Northampton is torpedoed and sunk at 10:48 p.m. A few minutes before that last, Tanaka orders withdrawal. In spite of this successful naval action, Tanaka is reprimanded for failing to deliver his supplies to the by now starving Japanese on Guadalcanal. That's not an exaggeration. They are by now facing starvation, which of course makes the rampant disease there all the worse. There's fallout on the American side as well, of course. He had spent 30 years building a record that won him, for 48 hours, a coveted independent flag command in combat. It took just over 40 minutes from the first radar contact to the last torpedo hit to forever blight his reputation. For Tassafaronga represented not just a defeat, but a humiliation. Put plainly, an inferior, cargo-entangled, and partly surprised destroyer squadron demolished a superior cruiser-destroyer group. It could have been worse. Few of the crippled cruisers would have survived had Tanaka's destroyers possessed their reload torpedoes. But heavy cruisers' 8-inch guns, they're slow and they're not built for shooting destroyers at middle range at night. And heavy ships in confined waters versus light ones is also not good, especially with a land background. The fire control radar really cannot deal with land behind them. This is also the last night battle that treaty cruisers, the American cruisers limited in size by the London Naval Treaty, fight. All 13 of the American heavy cruisers used so far around Guadalcanal have been sunk or damaged. If the Joint Chiefs in the comfort of Washington offices needed any confirmation of the Japanese determination to hang on to their positions, then Guadalcanal was proving another lesson of just how difficult it was going to be to defeat them militarily. On the 3rd, the Japanese try another supply run with the drum method. 15 dive and torpedo bombers catch them, still some 250 kilometers out at sea, but only manage to damage one destroyer at a cost of 2 planes. The naval force successfully dumps 1,500 drums at Tassafaronga and heads out again. But American planes destroy around 1,200 of the drums. They will try again next week. The Americans are trying something of their own in the region on Papua New Guinea. On the 30th, Edwin Harding's force manages to finally penetrate the forward Buna defenses, but the rear defenses are only vulnerable to the heaviest mortar fire and the advanced stalls. With casualty rates sky high, not just from the Japanese, but also from all the perils of the jungle, Douglas MacArthur has Robert Eichelberger take over the 32nd Division with the parting words, "Go out there, Bob, and take Buna, or don't come back alive." He arrives December 1st at divisional headquarters 3 kilometers south of Buna to find that the men have not eaten in a day and have not had hot food for 10. Morale is at an all-time low as the men live in the swamps and the Japanese live among the sands of the beaches. Harding is relieved of his command and Eichelberger stops all action for the remainder of the week to sort out his command and make plans. Just 15 kilometers to the north, the Australians at Gona have the fun of making bayonet charge after bayonet charge and also taking huge casualties and not really making much headway this week at all, except breaching a small portion of the defenses on the 2nd. The Allied advance in Tunisia is slowing down as well. On the 28th, they take Jeddah, but the Germans are moving on their rear from Saint-Cyprien, and the Allies come under heavy attack the next day and begin to fall back. Winston Churchill broadcasts from London that the Italian people must choose between either facing a full-scale Allied offensive or rebelling against Mussolini. François Darlan, whom the Allies have put in local charge, broadcasts that since Philippe Pétain, Vichy French chief of state, is a prisoner, he, Darlan, is assuming the responsibilities of the French government. On the 1st, there are now 15,000 Germans in Tunisia, and there is a strong German attack near Taborba, which the Allies repulse with heavy casualties. 2 more German infantry divisions and most of the 10th Panzer Division are about to arrive. The Italians have shipped supplies in to help, but Allied air attacks are taking their toll. As over the next 2 days, 4 Italian convoys are at sea, but under threat from a British force of 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers, so 3 of the convoys are recalled. All 4 freighters of the 4th one are sunk. A bit of a spoiler. In December, the Italians will try to send 200,000 tons of supplies to Tunis and Tripoli, but 90,000 of this will be lost to Allied attacks by air and by sea. Axis commander Erwin Rommel urges Adolf Hitler to abandon North Africa, since they can expect no improvement in shipping and supply, so if the army remains here, it will be destroyed. Hitler refuses to even discuss it. On the 3rd, both Jeddah and Taborba are taken by the now arrived 10th Panzer Division. Actually, today on the 4th, the US 9th Air Force attacks Napoli, sinking 2 cruisers in the harbor and doing a lot of damage. This is the first American raid on mainland Italy. As for the Axis naval war in general for November, 119 ships are sunk for 807,700 tons. 729,100 tons of that is sunk by U-boats, making it the 3rd best month of the war so far for the Axis. 13 German and 4 Italian subs are lost. But there are plenty of other Allied attacks on land this week. Near Veliki Luki, Soviet attacks on Novosokolniki the 29th fail, but the Soviet 381st Rifles swing around the city from the north. Freezing winds and drifts of snow are really messing with the Germans' mobility, but though 8th Panzer Division attacks into the flanks of the 381st don't do a lot of damage, they do convince the Soviets to delay large-scale attacks on Veliki Luki itself and reinforce the 381st Rifles, sending in troops from around home. The result is that by the end of the day, the 30th, the Soviet attempt on Novosokolniki has failed, but the German attempts to relieve Veliki Luki have also failed. But because of weather, resupplying the garrison there by air is not possible, and even reaching the surrounded Gruppenmeier is going to be a major effort with the freezing weather and limited supplies. And they've already taken heavy casualties. In fact, Günther von Kluge wants to make a tactical withdrawal, but Hitler issues the order already the 29th. Combat operations in the Veliki Luki area are to be conducted so that contact with individual Kampfgruppen can be re-established. A withdrawal to the west is out of the question. This basically means that the Germans are required to continue attacking with inadequate forces and to hold shaky positions. Gruppenmeier is running out of ammo as well. On the 2nd, attempts to reach it before it is destroyed begin. And on the 3rd, Gebirgsjäger link up with them near Botovo. The men are in dire shape, with just a few hundred combat-fit men and no vehicles. They've either been destroyed or they're out of gas. It seems Operation Mars is also running out of gas. Its attacks on the Rzhev salient continue. However, those Soviet forces from 20th Army that cut the Rzhev-Sychovka railway line last week find themselves encircled early this week. Many units break out the night of the 29th, but they lose most of their armor doing so. On the 1st, 20th Army attacks again, but though they do make a hole 8 kilometers wide and 6 deep, they cannot exploit it for the rest of the week. The attacks against the west of the salient, which made real headway last week, do a little more pushing, but really peter out at the beginning of December. The whole Kalinin front's attacks are getting bogged down by this time because they have no reserves, since they're also attacking near Veliki Luki. Further south, Friedrich Paulus has big issues with his encircled 6th Army in Stalingrad. From Paulus's perspective, the most important task was to withdraw 6th Army's forces to the defense lines he had designated late on November 27th. No less of a concern to Paulus was the Army's precarious supply situation, which the Army was rapidly exhausting. Paulus also seriously doubted whether the Luftwaffe could make good on its promise of aerial resupply. Now, Erich von Manstein's Army Group Dawn, which I talked about last week, is to somehow make an offensive that will either reinforce or rescue 6th Army. But they can't do that without controlling staging areas, like on the Don River, opposite Rychovsky and Kotelnikovo. So he's going to focus there. Once the Red Army has dealt with 6th Army, they plan to launch Operation Saturn, as I mentioned last week. Its big goal is to destroy the Italian 8th Army and the German 17th Army Corps. Concentric attacks will link up around Milerovo and destroy both forces, then cross the Donets and head for Rostov. The real appeal of this plan is that if it is a success, then the issue of whether the Germans will reinforce or try to rescue 6th Army in Stalingrad is moot. The plans are still on track throughout this week. On November 28th, the 3 fronts that launched Operation Uranus, the Stalingrad counteroffensive back on the 19th and 20th, Southwestern, Don, and Stalingrad, resumed their attacks. They are not as successful as the initial attacks were. German 17th Army Corps actually counterattacks the 28th on Nikolai Vatutin's Southwestern Front's right wing, but they are thrown back. The Soviets there go on the defensive afterwards. Prokofy Romanenko's 5th Tank Army is being frustrated by both German and Romanian defenders along the Chir and Don rivers and still cannot take Surovikino or Rychovsky. He does get a bunch of reinforcements in both men and armor after this, but it takes days to integrate them into his plans. The fighting the rest of November along 5th Tank Army's whole front is inconclusive, though on the 30th, the Soviets have created a bridgehead on the Chir. The Axis really have to eliminate this before the Soviets can use it to bring large force over and use it as a staging point of their own to fight off any relief attempts at Stalingrad from the west. But the Soviets still do not take Rychovsky, Oblivskaya, or Surovikino. 10 days of combat attrition is a big factor, but also both the German and Romanian defense points on the Chir are pretty formidable strong points by now. As for the Don front, they're pushing east from near Kalach as the German 6th Army withdraws into the Stalingrad pocket. It's bloody, and they do make some good progress, but Ultimately, the combat operations conducted by Rokossovsky's 3 armies from 19th to 30th of November proved that it would take a major offensive, perhaps commensurate with a full-scale siege, to liquidate Paulus's encircled army. This also meant that the 3 Soviet fronts and 9 armies operating in the Stalingrad region were insufficient to conduct simultaneous offensive operations along Stalingrad's inner and outer encirclement fronts. Much of the Stalingrad front is actually doing side operations against 6 armies south and east, but the 51st Army is heading south towards Kotelnikovo, or is trying to do so. A raid on it fails, and then the German 6th Panzer Division arrives there with more than 150 tanks, and on the 30th, 51st Army goes over to defense. By this time, Manstein's Army Group Dawn has assigned Army Group Hoth, what's left of the 4th Panzer Army, plus what's left of 2 Romanian Army Corps, combined into a new Romanian 4th Army, a double job. The Romanians are to delay the Soviet advance on Kotelnikovo long enough for Hoth to put together a strike force to reinforce or rescue 6th Army. Of course, the fighting in Stalingrad itself continues for Chuikov's and Paulus's armies, but the tide seems to have turned a bit, for the Soviets are slowly and very bloodily grinding up the German 51st Army Corps in the streets of the city. So to sum up, the multiple difficulties encountered by all 3 Soviet fronts during the final week in November made it abundantly clear that the way they had organized their forces for combat during the successful penetration and encirclement operation no longer suited the existing situation. So today, the 4th, since the Don and Stalingrad fronts likely cannot destroy the Stalingrad pocket without help, Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army is given the job. And that is the week, with the fighting on all of the active fronts either inconclusive or not going very well for the attackers. Okay, Reunion Island is liberated this week, but that is such a major milestone in the war that we did a whole special about it. Seriously, I insisted, Sparty insisted, Astrid insisted, and we actually broke our rule about not covering individual battles to cover the titanic struggle for Reunion Island. In Britain, the Beveridge Report is published this week, which proposes huge changes and expansions to Britain's social welfare system. There's also something else that happens this week that I ought to mention. It happens in Chicago, okay? On the 2nd, under Enrico Fermi's supervision, the first man-made, self-sustaining nuclear reaction is achieved. This potentially creates a huge new supply of energy that just grows and grows, and it can be used for all sorts of things, many of them extremely beneficial for all mankind. A little more seriously, we did a mini-series on the Cuba crisis when mankind came close to full-on nuclear war, covering it day by day for 13 days over on our Time Ghost channel. And if you have not seen it, then you are in for a very big treat. Here is prologue number 1. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week this week is Alan Osborne. It is the Time Ghost Army that finances this series, that Cuba series, all of our other series. So join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.